All right. Good morning, everyone. Sounds like you can hear me probably all right. Welcome to the Learning to Commercialize panel here at the ARPA-E Summit. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Doug Rand. I work in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy as the Assistant Director for Entrepreneurship, and it is an honor and a pleasure to be back at the ARPA-E Summit with so many exciting innovators on display and great plenaries as well. But I'm really excited about this panel. I think this is a real dream team we've got up here. And so I'll be very brief. We'll hear introductions from each of the panelists. I'll lead a brief Q&A up here on the panel. But then if any of you in the audience or out in the larger world tuning in have any questions, you can just text the question to the number you see on the display. And I will get it up here for the last 15 or 20 minutes. And we'll take your questions that way as opposed to trying to run around with mics. So please do not hesitate to send your questions to the number there. Just to get started with a couple of thoughts looking across the administration's priorities. As everyone here knows all too well, the challenge of climate change is immense, but so are the opportunities. And the stage is set really as never before for entrepreneurs and innovators to meet that challenge, both for the deployment of existing technologies that are already ready for the capital markets and where the costs have already come down dramatically, but also for a new generation of technologies that are being dreamed up in labs all across the country and across the world. So we are in a very different world now than we were just a year ago. At the last ARPA-E Summit, we have the historic Paris Agreement, where nearly 200 countries have made unprecedented commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and have each made commitments country by country that will be ratcheted up in ambition over time. That sends an unprecedented and very strong market signal that the transition to a low-carbon economy is underway and is irreversible. And many of the trends in that direction are already quite good. You probably all saw that last year, global investment in clean energy infrastructure reached a new high. It needs to keep going up, but again, the trend is good. And at the same time that the world is coming together to accelerate deployment of existing technologies, and the president is moving forward with an ambitious set of policies, from the Clean Power Plan to energy efficiency regulations to advance that. We also are doing an enormous amount to set the stage for the next generation of breakthrough technologies that will the Recovery Act that the president signed 7 years ago, and that really provided the seed funding for ARPA-E and got this entire agency off the ground. I was just talking with a colleague of mine who was his first day at OSTP was the day that the Recovery Act was signed. And he was reminiscing about how far we've come from that moment, which was not only a huge and critical stimulus for the overall US economy, but also the greatest single investment in clean energy, R&D, and deployment in history. And he said, look how far we've come. 7 years ago, I was just showing up and this bill was being signed, and now we're doing summits. This is a real agency with an incredible portfolio of nearly 500 projects that have collectively raised $1.2 billion in private capital as follow-on investments. That is an immense achievement, and we are incredibly optimistic about what's ahead. So we've got incredibly strong market signals for deployment of existing technologies. We've got unprecedented and growing investments in basic and applied R&D for clean energy. And in between, getting those ideas from the lab to the marketplace is really hard. As it should be. These are tough scientific problems. These are tough commercialization problems. It's been hard. It will continue to be hard. But fortunately, we've seen, just in the past couple of years, the emergence of new models for helping entrepreneurs and innovators navigate that rocky path from the lab to the marketplace. That's why I'm so thrilled to be up on stage with several people who have really dedicated their lives to helping navigate that passage. So what I'd like to do next is call on each of my co-panelists in turn to do their best 2-minute elevator pitch to everyone in the audience. Before I do that, though, I wanted to get just a show of hands so we have a sense of who's in the audience. So if we could start by raise your hand if you are a clean energy entrepreneur. Fantastic. Raise your hand if you are a scientist in an academic setting. Great. Raise your hand if you were here from a big company. Okay. Raise your hand if you're from a venture capital fund or other financer of innovation. Okay. Did I leave out any other categories that we should know about? Raise your hand if you're from a national lab. Fantastic. Okay, great. I think this is the right audience. I think this is the right panel. So without further ado, Jean, let's have your, please introduce yourself, where you're from, and the elevator pitch about what your commercialization group does.
I'm Jean Redfield. I'm the CEO of Next Energy. And Next Energy is a 501c3 nonprofit incubator and accelerator for energy and transportation technologies. And we're probably one of the oldest ones sitting up here. We actually predate ARPA-E. We were actually founded in 2002, way back in the olden days. And we were founded by the state of Michigan, predominantly focused on the transportation sector, recognizing that the energy issues associated with transportation are truly true challenges to the U.S. competitiveness and the regional economy that Michigan leads in automotive. So at Next Energy, we basically do a couple of things. We provide a bunch of services to small businesses and university and national lab research teams, including tech vetting, business consulting, access to funding, I-Core energy and transportation training. In addition to the services side of the house, though, we also host demonstration and pilot programs. We're right at that pivot point of proof of concept, typically in the commercialization process. And we have a living lab demonstration center in Midtown Detroit, where we can host connected vehicle, electrified vehicle, microgrid, and whole building systems with a variety of embedded capabilities in the living lab of the Next Energy Center. And I think that's my 2 minutes.
Thanks, Jean. Elon.
Great. So my name is Elon Gore. I direct a program called Cyclotron Road. We're basically set up to address the idea that entrepreneurship is hard. You hear the stat about startups and how many succeed. What you don't often hear is that, normally most of the startups that people are talking about, at least today, are software startups. And it turns out if you're doing hardware, if you're doing what we like to call hard technologies, materials, chemistry, physics-based startups, it's a lot harder. And it's a lot harder because in today's digital age with a software startup, you can wake up one day with an idea, and by sitting on your couch with a laptop, you don't need a lot of infrastructure. You can try out a lot of things. You can test market traction. You've got a phenomenal resource base on how to start companies in software. Basically, every blog out there gives you the cookie cutter recipe for how to do that. And when you're ready to look for funding, there's a road. Right, in Silicon Valley called Sand Hill Road, and you can just walk through and get all of the investors there. And if you flip that story and if you think of someone starting a really hard materials or chemistry technology, it's just a different world, right? You can't get started with your idea with a laptop. You really need some serious infrastructure or research lab. The blogs that you're reading about how to start a company don't necessarily apply to really hard technical challenges in capital-intensive industries. And the funding landscape is very different. So Cyclotron Road is basically about trying to take the people who want to take that first step entrepreneurially with a hard technology and give them a platform that addresses those challenges. Probably the most, the biggest of those is the infrastructure question. And so we are based out of Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, one of kind of the national treasures in the national labs, world-class research lab, about an $800 million a year research institution with facilities and expertise across a variety of scientific areas. And we basically say, if you're an entrepreneur, the first year or two of this type of project is really going to be pre-commercial. It's going to be figuring out how you take your concept. What should the product be? What should the technology be? What should the business model be? So do that in a very efficient way, leveraging our national resource. And in the meantime, let's get some expertise, both in terms of our team at Cyclotron Road and outside, to try and help give some insight into what are the right considerations for starting a really hard technology and one for industrial markets like energy. And let's try and use this as a focal point for the right network of partners and investors that are most suitable. essentially trying to just drastically reduce the barriers to getting started. We can talk more about it.
Thanks. Lydia.
Hi, my name is Lydia McClure. I'm the Program Director at the National Science Foundation for Innovation Corps, or I-Corps. And I-Corps really started, it's about as old as ARPA-E, six years ago. And the idea came out of the SBIR program. So how to better prepare researchers to get the SBIR funds or compete in venture capital. So the idea is use the support that you have around in your communities, but every plan you have is not going to survive the first test with the customer. So what we do is we provide small 50K grants and then run a program. So we don't just give you the money and walk away, which most programs at NSF do. But we do run a program on you and teach you how to test your research on the customers that hopefully will want to buy what you're going to make. So it's a training program for researchers. And the idea is help you understand what your technology is capable of. You are the best ones to understand how to make a pivot, how to change what your technology roadmap may look like, how to better suit the customers. So you can do it. You don't need a consultant for that. It's great to have experts and advice, but the technologists are really the ones that we focus on. And there's been a lot of excitement with the I-Corps program. Since that initial start, we've launched 7 nodes around the US and 50 sites, and all of these are creating this innovation network. And in addition to that, we now have 17 other federal agencies that are launching various versions of I-Corps. So you'll hear more about those from Jean and other people on the panel. That I-Corps is really an idea of testing customers. So technologists testing their customers in a hypothesis-driven way. So hopefully that's something that resonates with all of you.
Hi, I'm Richard Adams. I'm with the National Renewable Energy Lab. I run our Innovation Entrepreneurship Center. And we are very deeply immersed in this area of trying to bridge the gap between technology, taking companies through the commercialization path, and then linking them up with investors. And so we run a number of programs, one of which you might have all heard of, which is a program called IN2 that we do in partnership with Wells Fargo. It's a $10 million program. Wells Fargo funded us to support startups in the building space, commercial and industrial building space, to provide what we call some adult supervision. So really giving companies the opportunity to work with the national lab to be able to move those technologies along the commercialization path to a point where they could potentially be tested and deployed on a Wells Fargo building. So that's one of the programs we run. We also run a number of other programs which are, I think, also very important. A number of these are sponsored by the Department of Energy. There's a small business voucher program. We run a version of I-Corps that Lydia just talked about called LabCorps, where we're educating our researchers on how to think about taking their technologies out into the marketplace. We also have a program called Incubate Energy, which again we run on behalf of DOE, which is again supporting the incubation community in clean tech. And then we do a lot of work with the investment community, including our annual Industry Growth Forum, which is a program that we've been doing for over 20 years now, which is really about trying to convene companies looking for money with the investment community that's investing in this space. So wide range of things that we're trying to touch, a wide range of activities and programs that we're focused on in terms of trying to get and speed up, as Ilan said, speed up that process for technology companies to get from where they are today to where they need to be in terms of touching the market.
Great. Thank you for those introductions. The first question I would want to ask is related to everything that is not funding. Right, so there are plenty of panels on how to get funded. That is an overwhelming concern of many entrepreneurs and innovators, as it should be. But I think each of you has alluded to the fact that there's a whole range of other considerations, challenges and opportunities that are on the commercialization path that really have little to do with funding or predate funding or are prerequisites for funding. So I'd love to hear each of you talk about what you've learned in terms of the many entrepreneurs and innovators you've interacted with and you've supported, and that maybe many in this audience should be thinking about that are a bit more diverse in terms of what folks are working towards than just the funding question?
I guess I'll go first. I think almost everything we do is actually not about the funding. It's about working with the technology teams to really get at the essence of what's the value of that technology. And oftentimes the value of the technology is not likely to be discovered without something like the I-Core customer discovery process or pretty intensive introductions to industry. And it's also not likely to be delivered unless it's in the context of other relevant technologies. Energy and transportation technologies are very systems intensive. So the idea that a silver bullet is going to change how that world works today is pretty far-fetched. But the idea of advanced material or an advanced chemistry or an advanced software solution can transform the environment in the context of other technologies, that's absolutely possible. So figuring out how to connect those technologists with appropriate partners, how to work with them so they can really define the value proposition in the context of a solution, not in the context of a science response, is an important part of what we do. And it is a whole continuum of services, all the way upstream with tech vetting, where sometimes you have to talk about ugly babies, and you have to talk about why they're ugly, and you have to talk about what needs to be done before they're beautiful to the market. And then how do we keep connecting those technology teams to the right partners, to the right resources, and ultimately to the right money to keep them moving along the commercialization path?
Yeah, I'd say we look at funding, and one of the biggest issues we see in early entrepreneurs is they think that their goal is to go raise money.
Nope.
And actually at the earliest stages, especially kind of for hard industrial technologies, as Gene's saying, we actually think getting funding early can be more of an anchor and a crutch and can kill you, largely because unlike software where you can get that first tranche of funding and iterate and pivot 10 times to figure out where you're going, you're going to need the first tranche of funding and the next one and the one after that, and it's going to have to lead to somewhere. And if your first funding locks you in to some trajectory that wasn't the right one, that can actually be really detrimental. And so, we try and ask the questions of, before you're raising money, it's what kind of money, and from whom, and for what purpose, and what's the long game on this. And to answer that, I think others will have similar perspectives, but you think about I-Core, right? I mean, the first question is, well, what's the technology market fit going to be? What's the customer? But you have to also think about things like, technoeconomics, right? What's the cost performance of this going to end up as, not in the first prototype or the first customer, but when you're actually at scale. And it's not until you do those things that you can say, all right, here's the path we're trying to take. So that's the way we've been approaching it.
I think that's a very similar to what I was about to say, but there's more involved, right? So I'll focus mostly on communication then. So as a technologist, and I was one, a basic scientist even, so that's even more difficult, but I always led with, my technology does this. You walk into a room for an investor, and I've seen many technologists do this, they walk in and have 30 slides of their technology. You can see the glaze that comes over an investor's entire face, not just their eyes, right? Having the ability through, if you do customer discovery through I-Core, or if you go through a corporate partner who helps you engage and learn the right language, then instead of saying my technology does this, you start saying my customers need this because, and you start talking about value propositions, and you start talking about channel partners and your economics. And as soon as that conversation changes so it sounds a little bit more like what they're used to hearing, now you don't have to talk about going to money or not going to money. You are already on a playing field, and you just start talking about milestones and technology milestones and commercial milestones. So that communication is a really important aspect of going through a program like I-Core or one of the other programs on the stage, because that allows you to now open the door and communicate. You can walk into the room, but you may not be saying anything.
Yeah, I think I'd make a couple of comments. One is when you think about a program like IN2, we really sort of reverse engineered the traditional accelerator incubator type model, because our belief was that the focus needed to be on the technology. And so we spend most of the money that's in that program on moving the technology and advancing the technology to a point where it can be deployed and tested, whether it's on a Wells building or somewhere else. So our focus was on de-risking the technology process, so that at a point where you're talking to an investor, you're able to say this technology's not only been vetted at a lab, but it's proven out to work. But then also with the opportunity to test and deploy it on a Wells building, we're de-risking the market for someone, so we potentially have a first end use customer built into the process. And so that makes that program pretty unique. I think the other comment that I would make is that at the same time, what we're trying to do with this whole continuum is continue to link entrepreneurs with the right resources at the right time. And I'm a former entrepreneur, and I know one of the frustrations for entrepreneurs is, you get to a point where you've got to go and find the next set of resources or the next set of help that you need. And so we've been very focused through the IEC on ensuring that we're connecting the dots for the individual entrepreneurs. So that's the other aspect of this is think not just about where you are today, but where you need to go and what resources you might need and who you can go to and get those.
Richard, can you talk a little more about the role of facilities in terms of lowering transaction costs and hopefully reducing the risk of failure? Because you're at a national lab, it's a huge national investment.
Yep.
I think NREL's done incredible work opening up the lab to outside innovators, and so we'd love to hear more about how you see the role of expensive facilities being opened up to entrepreneurs and innovators, and then I think there's other panelists who have their own experiences to weigh in as well.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Doug. That's a great introduction. So one of the things I like to say at conferences like this is we're open for business. And one of my pet peeves is that, that people don't recognize national labs as an asset and a resource that you as entrepreneurs can go and use. So that's, let me just set that aside. We are there as a resource for all of you to be able to come and use. We have various mechanisms that you can engage with us in order to get into the lab. I mentioned the small business voucher program earlier. That's one example. Things like IN2 are another example.
You should tell them the website for small business vouchers, because that's a live thing, right?
Google small business.
SBV.org.
Google it.
Yeah.
I don't know the website.
It's SBV.org.
Oh, thanks, mate.
And one thing I like about it, and that's particularly relevant for entrepreneurs, is that there's multiple rounds per year.
Yep.
You get to propose your own research project. You don't have to shoehorn into something the lab is asking for. And it's also free, subsidized R&D collaborations.
Yeah,
so we're really keen on this model, and we hope it continues to grow.
Yeah, and I think what Doug said typifies the things that we're trying to do to make it easy for entrepreneurs to work with the lab. So the other perception that's out there that's always frustrating is that we're hard to work with. We're either expensive, we're difficult to work with, we're hard to contract with. That's really not true as a generality. We make it as easy as possible to work with startups. For example, we have a program called the NREL Commercialization Assistance Program where we can provide up to 40 hours of free time. The process for getting involved in that is a phone call to someone on my team. We put together a 2-page agreement that outlines the work that's going to be done, and we line you up with a researcher inside of NREL to do that work. So we are there as a resource. We have fabulous equipment, facilities, and most importantly, I think, intellectual capital amongst the people that are working in those facilities. And really, really it is a resource that any entrepreneur that's operating in this space should try and take advantage of.
I'll go there. At the National Science Foundation, we have several mechanisms to help facilitate research with academia. So you are in academia right now, then you can be approached by a corporation or a small business and do sponsored research with that entity. And that's facilitated through your university. The National Science Foundation has created, we have an acronym, as everybody does, IUCRC, and that's those are held at different universities, and they're specific to certain industries. So there are several different ones involving energy and clean energy. And what that is, it's a consortium of corporations that come and work with a group, 15, 20 different academics at one institution or between institutions, to really facilitate the movement of research and the best use of resources. So there are various different ways of bridging this community and making sure to use what academia has, use what the national labs have, and get small businesses and corporations to work streamlined together on the technology side. We're still working on how to get the commercial applications to be more streamlined as well.
I think there's one more piece around the facilities. I think the national labs and the universities are great about being able to prove out the technology at the level of deep science and data analytics. You still got to convince a customer to try it for the first time. And when you're talking about something that's going into a building or into a car, it's really tough to get that industry to say, yeah, I'll give that a try. So one of the things that Next Energy really focuses on are those first deployments. And oftentimes we'll take them into our living labs and we'll live with the consequences. You know, the fact I go into my office with the latest lighting technology and probably about a quarter of the time, my lights don't go on. Okay, I got plenty of outdoor windows. Our center does lots of daylight harvesting. I know which particular technology company has their lights and sensors in my office right now. I send them the email. They send me the logon code. I turn my own lights on. There aren't very many other customers that are willing to put up with that. So that first customer program, a real building, a real car, a real connected vehicle system, a real next generation vehicle charging system, that gets enough real-world use that you're getting the response of the customer. You're able to work out some of the glitches of just basic manufacturing and installation, yet you have a forgiving customer that's going to give you the real feedback. And that's kind of the proof of concept demonstration point that Next Energy focuses on. And we have a set of corporate partners that are willing to also take that first step with the startups. So sometimes it's at our center, sometimes it's with a local real estate owner and in a different commercial building setting. Sometimes it's with a local fleet owner around a specific car technology or charging technology. But we kind of specialize in matching you up with that first real world application so you can work the bugs out on how does the real world work versus a simulated and analytically derived world. Because both steps are really critical to getting out to first customers.
You know, the only thing I would say about facilities and infrastructure is, you know, at Cyclotron Road, we talk a lot about leverage, right? As an entrepreneur at the early stages, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for resources that you can leverage, and certainly for hard tech folks that need a lab, facilities are really, really important. But what we found is actually the benefit is not look at all the money I'm going to save necessarily by using, it's time, right? I mean, your biggest resource is time, and if it's going to take you, you know, in order to buy the $1 million piece of equipment that you might be able to walk into NREL or Berkeley Lab to use, you know, if that means it's going to take you 6 months to find an investor to get the money to set up a lab, you know, if you're a year in before you start doing experiments, you know, that's right, almost 1% of your life, right? Probably more than 1% of your life, depending, before you've gotten started, right? So the time efficiency is really crucial. So we piloted Cyclotron Road with 6 project teams and found that, you know, after accepting them to the program, we had teams that within about a month were actually going from, you know, hey, I just put in two weeks notice at my job, I'm actually doing experiments and learning about the technology risks and issues. And that's enormous, right? Because it actually gives you the chance to get some rapid cycles and iterations. So always be thinking about leverage and always be thinking about time.
I think you're also hitting on a really important point, and it's the capital efficiency. Energy is a super capital intensive industry. The idea that we're going to invest in enough capital for every single good idea to run its own finance path, we're going to end up wasting too much capital. So accessing the capital that's already been spent in a time-efficient way is a way to actually do both.
And it can be early in development or it can be later in demonstration, as Jean was saying. Either way, same principle applies.
Great. Well, let's put a face on some of this innovation. I'd love to ask each of you to talk about at least one, or if you can't choose among your favorites, a couple of some of your favorite success stories that you've seen coming up the ranks and that you've been able to support.
I can start. We have over 750 I-Corps teams that have gone through. I came from the University of Texas at Austin, and there was one particular team that I was able to follow since I was still there at the time before I took the rotation at the National Science Foundation. They went through the program in 2012. And that means they flew from Austin to a New York cohort, went through the 100 customer discovery interviews led by a New York group of instructors, and then came back to Austin. And originally they were solar cells, so they're making in the photovoltaic lab out of UT Austin. And they were really interested in selling into the developing world. They had a very low efficiency but also low cost technology. They thought that would be the perfect fit. Grad student and a postdoc. And they were spending a lot of time on this commercial endeavor. They did that 100 customer discovery interviews, and you can probably imagine, identified that the opportunity was large, but the ability to get there would cost a lot of money and wouldn't necessarily bring back the revenue that would support a model to sustain. So they identified several other markets to go forward to get them to the point where they can then serve this other market that's their original goal. So they were able to identify individuals that want batteries for low cost and low power. You can imagine that being, an Internet of Things device, a Hallmark card that sings, a shampoo bottle that has an LED light on it. There are a lot of other applications that really were a need right now for this technology. And I can say these individuals are still very much going to deliver upon their dream and their vision of helping provide power in the developing world, but they have also identified a sustainable business model. So I use them as my example.
Thanks.
So Cyclotron Road hasn't been around as long as some of these other programs, but we ran a pilot, and I should say, when thinking about success and when thinking about Cyclotron Road in general, our view is, we can think about mentorship, we can think about training, we can think about resources, but it starts with the people. And Cyclotron Road is basically all about finding just amazing, folks who are all in innovators, all in entrepreneurs, and they're driving things. And so I'd say the success of the program so far has been just finding people who can make things happen and giving them a platform to do that. But I'll give just sort of a bit of a different example because it's timely today. Most of the way we talk about success so far in the pilot has been, we take someone who's at a really early stage, doesn't really know how to get started because it's an expensive project, way too early and risky for investors. We have several projects that came into the program by leveraging some of the facilities and expertise at the lab, got to understand better some, can you hear me? I'm going to speak up, but if the mic comes back on. Got to understand better some of the, okay. Several of them, I'm going to get rid of this.
Oh, here comes the hand mic.
Thank you. Great. Hello? You can hear me. So, several of the teams came into the program leveraging facilities, were able to do some key experiments, understand technical risks, but also start, probing the network of experts and partners that we have connected to the program, understanding things like first markets, using that leverage and that knowledge to get, say, a first grant from a competitive funding agency like an ARPA-E. We had several projects that got, $500K, $1 million within the first year from a competitive grant, which then, with the knowledge about the technology, the knowledge about the market, they could go find sort of a first investor, a private investor to come alongside that, thinking about the path of where that investment may go, and being able to do in a capital efficient way several learning cycles. And that goal has been sort of, okay, let's evaluate the first market, evaluate the techno-economics, figure out the aligned funding source. One of our project teams, and I'm not sure if he might not be in the room, but Marcus Lehman came into the program, and he's working on wave power, wave energy technology, which is commercially a very, very challenging space, especially for something at the early stage. And the idea that you might develop that technology and just find a first investor that's going to write a small seed check and turn that into a wave business is sort of hard to fathom. And in thinking, in really strategizing with Marcus, the idea he had was, look, we don't believe that the wave energy technology designs out there are the optimal designs. And we think there's an opportunity to come up with something that's dramatically better from a technology standpoint.
And where we realized strategically was that the goal for him, yeah, he needed to think about first markets and these things, but the real goal and the real opportunity was show that there is a technology design that could be much better. And in sort of thinking about the opportunities for that, how do you show that there's a better design, and how do you actually validate that so people will believe you? It turns out right around the time he started the program, the Department of Energy launched a big open competition, a Wave Energy Prize, to do an open competition and compare different designs. And he said, hey, I got to go, and actually be a part of that competition. And we had a lot of debates around, competitions can be a distraction to the core business. Maybe you should be spending time thinking about first customers. And ultimately said, I think you're right. If you can show people there is a better design here, that will then set you up for long-term success. So we were really excited today. They actually announced the finalists for that, the 10 finalists out of 100 competitors. And his project CalWave was at the top of that list. And so the idea here is just, again, thinking about strategy, thinking about where you're putting your time, and making sure that you've got that aligned with some long-term goal. That's what we're trying to bake in, and so that was a big success, I think, for that one project. But they all look different, right? And it's a matter of, based on where you are, what you're working on, and what the strategy is, what does that next win look like? And then normally it's not, get an angel investor to write you a first check.
No,
Right?
none of them are like that. Elon makes a really good point. Each of the successes looks different. Next Energy's been around since 2002. We've helped attract over $1.6 billion into the state of Michigan in the energy and transportation space. Last year alone, we had almost $90 million in follow-on funding for about 50 small companies that we work with. And our successes are things like an advanced lighting solutions company that does a daylight harvesting LED technology that actually works and looks like a skylight that can mimic basically the diurnal cycle and things like that. Pretty straightforward, pretty cool, a pretty straightforward product, pretty cool technology behind it. And our role was helping them get some first demos where they learned things about manufacturing, packaging design, and installation requirements that transformed how they designed their product, because they actually had to figure out how to box it, ship it, get it to a site, and get a regular person able to install it and maintain it. That's invaluable, cuts years off of their product development timeline because it gets those real issues on the front end. One example. Another example is a really interesting software solutions company. Was part of a DoD program way back about 9 years ago on how do you take multiple sources generation, integrate them into a single microgrid so that we can actually run forward operating bases off of whatever dirty power and local renewables we have, in addition to the gen sets we plan for, because we're tired of hauling these gen sets and all the jet fuel for them all around the world. But if we don't run off of our own gen sets, we can't trust the power. So that power conditioning and control for microgrid technology, very different kinds of services we provided, very different access to facilities provided, but both small companies that are growing fast now because of their ability to get into those demonstrations, to figure out how their technology actually provides value, and to keep moving. So success stories, they come in a million different flavors.
Yeah, I'll just briefly touch on a couple of things. One is, like Cyclotron Road, a lot of the programs we're running, including Ion 2, are pretty early stage. Although with Ion 2, we've now got two companies, Whisker Labs and Liquid Cool Solutions, that we're currently talking to Wells Fargo about deploying on their buildings. So we are successful in terms that we have moved those technologies through the milestones at the lab to a point where we can now start to have the conversation about moving them into a building or into the built environment and testing them in a real field setting. The other sort of inverse of that, or the flip side of that, is the Industry Growth Forum that I talked about earlier. Just to give you a metric from that, since 2003, companies that have participated in the forum or presented at the forum have raised over $5.5 billion. So, we know we can have an impact by playing a convening role to bring together the right people, that are the people looking for money with the people that are looking for new technologies to invest in. So just a couple of samples there.
Great. Well, in the time we have remaining, I'd like to ask the panel some of the questions that you all in the audience have been texting over. So it's a good problem to have, more questions than we can possibly get through, but that shouldn't be a barrier. Please send more. I will try to filter them and pitch up the best ones. So one that I think is a is a very interesting question that we haven't really addressed yet, is what is the perhaps current versus ideal role of a utility, both in terms of being an early customer, collaborative R&D, how can utilities be more innovative in terms of the resources and partnering that they offer for new technologies?
Well, utilities are at the center, right? And there are different utilities leaning into leadership roles in different areas of the country. And that's good news and that's tough news. The fact that we regulate one of our fundamental markets on a state-by-state and sometimes utility-by-utility basis makes it really hard to provide common incentives for utilities to want to play. So for our business, what we typically do is figure out which utilities, based on their current paradigms, have the most to gain by playing in this. So we partner with EPRI and IEEE and some of the major utility-based trade associations or technology support organizations to get access to those utilities. And of course, we partner with our local utility quite a bit. But what's the real role of the utility and how can we provide sort of common ways for them to play in this space? I don't think we're going to get a good answer on that. So we have to take it where we can get it. California is a great place. Utilities are very forward-leaning there because of the policy environment. North of New England and the PJM Power Pool is a great place. I mean, we've done bidirectional charging assets aggregated by a retail marketer, bid into the PJM Power Pool to figure out what's the value of bidirectional charging as a reliability a resource to the grid. Really cool business model and technology deployment, right? And we're in Michigan, working in PJM. So you just look for those forward-leaning utilities and those forward-leaning policy environments and make sure those are the partners you reach out to. I don't know if you guys have more to say about utilities. In fair disclosure, I was a former executive at a major IOU. So I kind of have that utility mindset as half my brain.
I would just say, thinking about the early stages, we see an enormous kind of opportunities for utilities to step in and think about innovation earlier, especially given the radical transformations that are happening. Central role, but probably a lot bigger of a role that there's an opportunity to play.
Other thoughts? Okay. Let's see. A kind of technical question that I think a couple of the panelists here could address is, can you help folks understand all the different flavors of I-Corps? So what's the difference between applying for and participating in I-Corps through NSF? What are the eligibility requirements versus the LabCorp model that Richard talked about versus Next Energy's implementation of I-Corps? I mean, the good news is there is this proliferation. I think maybe the challenging news is it might be hard for someone just coming to this to understand, what am I eligible for? How do I apply? How do I take advantage?
Sure. So we have I-Corps programs around the U.S. that everybody is eligible for. No, we as in I-Corps.
Okay, great.
Including Next Energy's program, which is partnered with one of the NSF I-Corps nodes out of the University of Michigan. So these nodes and sites have been asked to just provide the I-Corps curriculum and training model to whoever shows up, right? So that's available for everyone. They don't necessarily provide funding for you to participate in the program, but the education is there and the resources are there. To participate in the NSF I-Corps program, you need to have NSF lineage, which through your technology. But that also means if you participate in one of these site programs or node programs, and they provide you a small, we do provide $1,000 to $3,000 grants. Now you have lineage, so you can apply to the $50,000 NSF I-Corps program and participate in the national program. The ARPA-E researchers that are in the room, you also have the ability to apply through your ARPA-E PD to participate in the NSF I-Corps program, and that also comes with the $50K, but that's dependent on the ARPA-E PDs. If you're Homeland Security, that's the same thing. If you're an SBIR recipient from Homeland Security, you can talk to your PD and participate. The LabCorp program has its own application process and is for the national labs. The NIH also has its own program, and that's through the SBIR Phase 1 program. So I wish there was a website like the sbv.org, which we are building this. But as you come upon it, you can always email me or one of the other colleagues and ask, am I eligible and how am I eligible and when can I participate? And we'd be happy to help you. If you want to talk more about LabCorp.
Yeah, LabCore is a program that's designed to help our researchers that are at national labs understand more about the market in terms of the technology that they're working on. So it really is it's a closed program per se. It's not available to outside entrepreneurs. So again, we're taking a lot of the models around lean startup and customer interface and applying those to the researchers in a lab environment. So that's kind of the difference between the program there.
I think one of the important considerations for iCore or LabCore is timing. Finding the one that's at the right time for when you can actually put your team's attention on it. And then the second one, and it's a secondary one, but it could matter, is location. Because at least in our energy and transportation iCore, we've done a lot of work to both customize the curriculum around the case study work, but also create a curated network of access to industry experts that will help in that customer discovery process. So coming to Detroit, if you've got a transportation technology or an energy storage technology, an Internet of Things technology, depending on whether it's a hardware-based versus software-based, we can do a pretty good job of getting you up the learning curve on that customer discovery process just because of who's already in the region and how you can access that during your iCore experience. So time and place are considerations as well as eligibility.
Great. We've gotten a couple of very specific questions about small business vouchers, but I would suggest for those, I really urge anyone who asked those questions or wish they'd asked those questions to come up to us after the panel so we can really get into the weeds with you on some of these technical questions that have come in. One last question, though, on a more general note that I thought was very appropriate for this panel is, based on what you've learned so far and all the programs you've run, what are some of the key do's and don'ts for spin-offs from the academy, from university-linked startups, with regard to the ideal involvement of grad students versus postdocs versus faculty?
I can go. So I've spent most of my life in academia. I'm an academic at heart, and the National Science Foundation is definitely an academic-focused place. The don'ts are, don't sit in your lab and build something. That's the common mantra, don't build anything, nobody's going to come. Get out of the building, talk to people, build your own network, don't rely on someone else's network to get you going. We have built networks. All of our programs, everybody that supports entrepreneurs has networks to help you, but you need to build your own network at the same time. So don't just rely on other people to get the commercialization done. In terms of grad students and postdocs, there's a reason the iCore program facilitates and lifts up grad students and postdocs. We don't necessarily push down PIs or faculty, but we know that the grad students and postdocs are the ones that are about to graduate. They're about to take on all the risk of leaving a university. And should they choose to start a tenure track position, or should they go to a corporation, or should they go start their own company, that's what iCore is here to help untangle all of those decision points and help make a decision in one way or the other. Whatever you learn when you talk to your customers and you learn the process of customer discovery, it's going to be helpful no matter where you go. If you're going to stay in academia, you're going to write better, broader impacts to the National Science Foundation, and we're very appreciative of that. If you're going into a corporation, you're going to become a fantastic entrepreneur, right? You're going to be better at what you do inside of a corporate job. And if you do launch a company, hopefully you'll be much better at attracting customers and attracting outside funding. So in academia, it really is about understanding that you shouldn't stay inside your lab. Most of what you're doing there really needs to be understood better by the community.
So, I mean, I'd give a big do, which is, I think as scientists or researchers, technologists, you have a natural inclination to collect data. What we found is when it comes to strategy, when it comes to thinking about how do you start a company, a lot of researchers and scientists are not out there collecting data, right? They're not talking to enough people about how did you do it? What was your deal structure, right? And I think one of the things that we found in Cyclotron Road is you get a cohort of people together who are all going through the same experience. We saw this with our first cohort. They're talking to each other. They're saying, what have you learned? They're getting out and they're interacting with the network. We're really, we sort of boiled the ocean to find another great group of innovators. We had a chance now to do a second cohort within Cyclotron Road. We're really proud yesterday to announce that new cohort. And the first thing that we saw in interactions in the recruitment process and the review and selection, and these are folks from all over the country, mainly technical, many of them out of academia, was even just in the interview processes as they're interacting with our first cohort, they're picking up tips. You know, what lawyers are you using? How did you think about structuring that? And so the big do is find programs like those run by the people on this stage that are going to connect you with other people who are going through that experience. I'm seeing actually Richard and Andrew, two of our new cohort members for Cyclotron Road, are here. And you know, what we're excited about is we're going to make their lives easier by letting them collect that data more easily. So find those opportunities. I think they're all up here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. Well, one last question I had in the category of big think in the remaining time we have is I think it's worth reflecting. I mean, things move so fast, but sometimes it's hard to perceive that. 10 years ago, when you look at the software IT entrepreneurship ecosystem, there were only a tiny handful of what we now call startup accelerators in the entire country. I mean, they've proliferated massively in just the last 10 years. Most people did not walk around with a supercomputer in their pocket. Cloud services were still in their near infancy. University entrepreneurship programs were not nearly as widespread as they are now. So in just 10 years, we've moved from a world in which you really had to figure out almost everything you would need to become a software entrepreneur to a world in which there's just on-ramps everywhere. And you are all building a different but complementary ecosystem, I think, when it comes to hard tech entrepreneurship with clean energy applications. So if you think ahead 5, 10 years, what do you want the country to look like? What do you want the world to look like in terms of on-ramps and opportunities for entrepreneurs who want to solve these critical and immensely difficult challenges?
Which end do you want to start on? All right. I think the corporate partnerships are going to look different 5 years from now. I think our very largest global players are wrestling with how to do innovation well, and they're going to figure how to work within this ecosystem better than they do today, and the ecosystem is going to be better for it.
Yeah, I think the thing that's shifted very recently has a lot to do with what's happening here in DC. And I think, you know, from the White House to the Department of Energy, one of the things that's shifted is initiatives saying we've got to connect the dots between the science and the applications. You know, Startup America out of the White House, technology to market programs in DOE. I think we're now seeing the opportunity to get to support to say, you know, these can't be two different conversations. So I'd say, you know, if that trend continues, we'll have a much richer flavor of different ways that we work with and support scientists, entrepreneurs with big companies and partners, and that's really exciting.
So 10 years ago, I was that academic trying to spin out of the lab. So I think what really is going to change in the next 10 years is we're building what we call the National Innovation Network. People like me and people like you who can facilitate the next generation. You don't necessarily need a program to go through. It'll be you, right? We can have these one-off connection points that better strengthen the nation's innovation ecosystem, where you don't need to go through a program. You don't need to have, everyone will be a resource. All of academia will become more innovative, better understood. There'll be classes, entrepreneurial curriculum. You won't have to have as many incubators and accelerators because everybody will have this basic training earlier on. That's what I think is going to happen.
Yeah, I think the path to capital will look very different than what it does today. So I think instead of startups having to go and find venture fund or corporate sponsors to move their technology along, that we'll be looking at a different model for energy and clean energy, in which there'll be a structure that you go through that will reduce the amount of capital you need when you actually go looking for the capital, reduce the constraints on that capital from the venture capital side, but also may even mean you reach a point where you don't actually need that capital. We can actually get you directly to a customer and start to fund the activity that way as opposed to the traditional model.
Fantastic. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists. We really appreciate your time today. you have two options. You can go straight to lunch, which would be a rational thing to do, or you can come up and talk to any of us right now if your questions didn't get addressed. Thanks again.